There's two home ones. Yeah, so this is the most recent. I'm just gonna vamp through it. I'm not gonna worry about it. Okay, hello everybody. It's just the top of the hour now, so not very many people here compared to yesterday, so it's kind of sad. Here come some more folks. Let's start doing this bit. As people are getting in, we would like to remind you that this is still the IETF116 Media Over Quick Working Group, and that you are still being recorded. There is still a note well here, which contains information on both the IPR policies of the IETF and its code of conduct. Since Glenn already found the Easter egg, we updated the Easter egg to note that the working group knows that John Postel's middle name was Bruce. Otherwise, the note well is the same as it was yesterday, and generally speaking, the same as the one you've seen all week long if you have been joining us for the whole week. A reminder of the meeting tips: if you are in person, make sure to sign into the session using the MeetEcho tool, either the light version using the QR code as being demonstrated on the left-hand side of the room as you face forward, or with the general client. If you do join with the general client, please turn off your mic. And to be kind to the bandwidth, it would also be helpful to turn off any streams you're not actually planning on watching. You are required to wear a mask unless you're actively speaking at the microphone, as I am doing right now. Or if you are currently finishing up your snack, you may finish that up by having a bite or a sip, but please keep your mask closed when you are not doing that. We have Magnus here who's demonstrating taking a sip with his mask hanging off his ear, ready to reattach it at any moment, as he is doing now. Thank you, Magnus Westerland, aka Carol Merrill. For the remote participants, please make sure your audio and video are off unless you're currently presenting or asking a question. We strongly encourage you to have some sort of noise canceling technology, be it a headset or other sort of microphone. The session details have not changed since our first session, except this time Magnus Westerland, who was previously listed as a note taker, is in fact taking notes for us today, and will be selecting from the remaining bars of chocolate. Who's the other note taker?
I don't know. If someone wants to back up, there's more chocolate.
Yes, if somebody wants to put their hand up as a backup chocolate eater slash note taker, we will check to make sure you put in some actual notes before giving you the chocolate, but it's not a hard job. We have already done our agenda day 1. Agenda day 2 has seen some changes since you last saw it. And in fact, there was one change that didn't hold. So we have the catalog specification going first. Will Law will speak to that, and there'll be 10 minutes of discussion. Then the architectural issues discussion. Then I will chat for a few moments about how we frame an adoption call. Then Spencer will speak, although it says planning for next interims. If you actually look on the data tracker, the chair slides say that Spencer is talking about next steps for the use cases / scenarios draft. And then we'll finish up with Jordy giving us a
I submitted slides for them about 30 minutes ago.
I know, they have been updated. They should be present in the repo if anybody wants to look at them before we get to that point. And then Jordy will finish up with an open source demonstration of a proof of concept. Is there any other bashing of the agenda at this time? Hearing none. Will, do you want to drive the slides or do you want us to drive them?
You may drive.
Okay. This is confusing because we have 2 copies of everything.
If you hover over the I, it gives you a time.
Okay. All right. Let's do this one.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Will Law. This is a proposal basically for a catalog spec for MOQ compliant streaming formats. So if you've been following along, there's some new terms I'm introducing there. So this talk is actually going to describe what a streaming format is, what a catalog spec is, and how the two are related. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of assumptions. And again, these are not consensus assumptions. They are in the realm of proposal. Basically, that we can create what I'm writing here as a mock transport, or another word for it might be a base protocol. On top of that sit a number of streaming formats that can all interop at the same time on top of the transport. An example for a streaming format in the adaptive world would be HLS and Dash operating over HTTP in a network. The network itself doesn't need to understand HLS or Dash, it only understands HTTP. And I can have a lot of flexibility in innovating on my streaming format without having to go through and teach every relay some new form of the transport. So decoupling the transport from the streaming formats, I think, makes sense. Next slide. So to satisfy our charter, we have to present a working solution. We would need to define this transport, and then we'd need to find a streaming format, at least one that goes with it. We might define one for real-time interactivity. We might define one for a slightly higher format. They're quite specialized in their use cases, and it's up to us to determine how we want to split these apart. But that would be the minimum combination for this group to output. Next slide. So when I say they're separate, what are the responsibilities? What does the transport do versus the streaming format? So the mock transport defines the object model and the structure. A lot of the things we've been speaking about and we will speak about in the next session. It defines the addressing scheme, how you request a catalog and identify it, what are the rules that relays must follow for objects, priority, sending, dropping, etc., and how this mock transport maps to the underlying transports, web transport or raw quick. Those are all generic. I didn't mention media in any of those. On the other side of the aisle then, the streaming format is where the media comes to play. So it defines a catalog format and spec, it defines the media container, it defines how the media is mapped to the mock transport object model, and then workflow logic, which could include bitrate adaptation, content protection, access control, sync between tracks. It would also register itself to say, I am a streaming format, and now you know how to find me. I think there's a logical decoupling of these responsibilities. Today, we have everything munged together. And I think as it gets more and more complex and we address more use cases, it might make sense to separate them in this fashion. Next slide, please. So in this assumption is actually far more consensus around it, that the subscribable entities within our mock transport are called tracks. I have a collection of tracks. It started off as a broadcast, became an emission. Current term of art is a bundle. I'm calling it a package here, just to be generic. So a package is a collection of tracks. The catalog itself is a track, and that's important. It's just another track that is delivered by the system. And tracks have an identifier. And I think there's actually strong agreement on this concept so far.
Can I ask you to pause for a second? There are several people out there who are no longer wearing their masks and you're not eating actively. So I'd like to remind you that you do need to do that. And taking a sip every few minutes in order to keep your mask off is not acceptable. You have to keep your mask on. That's a basic requirement for being here. And if you can't manage that, we'll have to ask you to leave. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, next slide.
As it goes,
So there's two problems with what I just said. The first is, if I give you an address to a package of tracks, how do you know how to retrieve the catalog? And secondly, different streaming formats are going to have different ways to serialize their catalogs. So how can a client that's randomly given a catalog know how to parse it? So the draft I wrote proposes solutions to these two problems.
do you want questions as they come, or do you want to take it down?
If it's short, Spencer, go ahead.
I could wait. Yeah.
Okay, let's go. So problem number one, how to address it. So the catalog has a reserved identifier. It can be 0 if we have numeric identifiers, or it can be the string catalog if we have strings. I like the simplicity of that. I don't have to tell anyone in the room what the catalog is. It's very self-evident. A consequence of that, there can only be one track in a package that has this reserved identifier of either 0 or catalog. And some applications might want a multi-tiered catalog, in which case you must still define a single entry point that carries this reserved identifier. Next slide. So problem 2, how do I know how to serialize it? So a catalog is simply a track. A track is composed of objects, and objects have a header and a payload. So the proposal here is simply that in the case of a catalog, we define that the payload must begin with a var-int header that defines the type. The rest of it may be encrypted, is opaque to the actually the whole thing's opaque to the relays, but the rest of it will then be defined by that header type. Next slide. How do we keep a rein on these header types? We register them over at IANA, so we define a mock transport catalog type. Should probably be a streaming format type in retrospect, not a catalog type. The catalog definition is part of a broader streaming format. And example, I like to keep 0 reserved so we can experiment. You can distribute something through a CDN and it won't break because you're not triggering some behavior that's specific. And then you can go in and I just put definitions. A warp type like GOP per stream solution might find it's a streaming format of 1 and quicker, or a VR solution like that. Next slide. So dependency, it's interesting because a catalog is a track, it inherits some dependencies. I give 4 examples here. The first one is simply a track where there's only ever one catalog. So this would be, I set up OBS, I broadcast audio and video, and it never changes. I publish one catalog at the beginning, and it's done for the life of the stream. It would also describe a VOD asset, which we don't talk about much with MOQ, but I think VOD can clearly be in our scope, and we don't actually have to change too much in order to accommodate VOD. The second example B is where I have a live stream, and every minute or 30 seconds at some cadence, it puts out an independent copy of its catalog. So we defined that a group is by definition an independent object. So these are the catalog groups. And my syntax here is group 1 object 0, like 1.0 is group 1 object 0, group 2 object 0, etc. In the third version, item C, I show delta updates. So here I put out a big fat catalog. And then if I've got a lot of changes, say it's a web conference where stuff's changing all the time, but it's only changing for one person out of 500. I don't want to reissue the whole catalog. So I would simply do a delta update. That is, what is the change from the prior state? Then every once in a while, I'll resume at a new group, which is my independent description of the state of the broadcast. And the last one, D, is the intent is to show the hierarchical catalog. Here I show a parent catalog that's sent out once that just describes 2 child catalogs. One of them never updates. The other one updates, say, at add insertion intervals. So I could use that for add insertion. Now you might ask me, what does one of these catalogs actually look like? So let's go to the next slide. It might just look like this. This is the curly special. It's just the var-int plus a move, right? And the move has got the track IDs inside it. It's got a description of the media, and it's got your innets. It's everything you'd need to play a specific and constrained version of media over quick. Now, this is not nearly sufficient for more sophisticated applications. So let's go to the next slide. It's still valid, though. You could write a streaming format that is this. Here I'm showing JSON. Don't hang me for that. I'm not saying we have to use JSON. It's just a way to illustrate fields and some sort of structure. But here we got a version. We define some tracks. We give each track an ID. That's the basic requirement, what the catalog must do. It has to tell the client how to subscribe to the content. And in this case, we took that same init segment because this one is CMAF based, and we just base 64'd it and stuck it in our catalog. So this would also work. Our client would know how to subscribe, how to initialize, and how to begin playback on the content. Next slide. In this slide, in this example, I've got away from that base 64 and I just have separate fields pretty clearly defined. And also interestingly here, the init for each track is itself a track, which is an interesting way to distribute it. So I can distribute those at the beginning of my broadcast or update them at some frequency if I want to. but we can have initialization segments delivered via tracks as well as the media objects themselves. And next slide. This shows a Delta catalog update in the same syntax. Here I define a sequence number 214. It says, hey, I'm giving you a Delta against 213. I'm removing previously defined tracks numbers 2 and 3. I'm adding a new track number 4, and I'm changing a track number 1, changing its bit rate. So that's a very simplistic Delta description, but nonetheless, I think one that's quite practical. And then next slide. Now, if you're a fan of complexity, we might want to jump to something looking like this. This is a Dash manifest. And you may not like Dash, but Dash for 10 years has been negotiating with the media industry all the little things you need to actually make broadcast media compliant. And they're in there. I just changed the things in yellow, and that's actually all you need to change to make this work with a subscription mechanism. I define how to subscribe to the initialization track, how to subscribe to the media track. All the other information remains valid. So there's very interesting portability between Dash descriptions and HLS playlist descriptions if you want them into an environment that we can do with media over QUIC. And I think that's my last slide. If we go to the next one. Yep. And we have some questions in the queue.
Okay, Suhas, you're up first. Actually, you seem to have dropped out of the list, Spencer. But you're back. Okay, Suhas.
Hey, Will, thanks for presenting this. This work is needed, but I have a clarification question. In one example, you showed that the catalog has an init segment. Does that mean that whenever an idea refresh happens and we send a new group for a track, we should send a catalog update as well?
No, you would. Unless you're changing your codec. The only reason you need an init is to begin playback. It only has to be sent one because it's not changing. So it can be cached by the relays for a long period of time. You would only change it when you changed your video codec or anything that required reinitialization of the decoder. So that's why sending init data at a constant interval is bandwidth intensive.
Okay.
And maybe it's just a limit that I need to send it. If my CDN relay is, say, only holding content for 5 minutes, I would have to at least refresh this every 5 minutes. Otherwise, it's going to fall out of cache on the relay.
Makes sense. Thank you. This work is good. Thanks.
Just wanted to jump in and say we locked the queue just because it got kind of long. So
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Hi, Han from Huawei. Yeah, I support this idea. Actually, I think I am the first one proposing this idea in the GitHub. So I'm looking at it right now. It's 2 months ago. Actually, my GitHub username is vmetrics9000. So I support this work, and I think there is a lot of detail we need to work out. So I will now be joining the work.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. And I'm sorry if I'm presenting your idea. So if you were the first to do it, then.
No, I'm not trying to file a patent or something. I just show the interest, and I will now be joining the work.
Colin Jennings, I think this is great work. I'd love to see it going forward. Love to see a parallel thing for sort of web codec style codecs and containers and everything, just like you laid it out. I think it's like exactly the right model. So I think this is great. One completely trivial deep side point in there, when we get to the Delta encodings, I would probably favor a version where the only thing you could do is replace a track, maybe even replace, you don't really remove it, you replace a track with a nothing track to remove it or something, but make sure that our Delta encodings that really, we didn't really have add and subtract, we just had update some clear portion of it just to make it really simple, because I've dealt with a bunch of these Delta encodings and they can complicate really fast, but that's a totally irrelevant side comment for way down the road.
You just want a simple verb that is replaced with something.
I want something that's a guaranteed conflict free in that there can never be a merge conflict. That's the important principle and is easy to implement. But again, the whole basic idea and then, 99% is like awesome. I love it. I'd like to see us move forward this quickly. Thanks.
Okay.
Spencer Dawkins, and I don't know if it was your second or third slide, but the one that had here's the transport stuff on the left and the other stuff on the right. I think that that's absolutely critical for us to. I think maybe the one before that. Yeah, that one. Yeah. Slide 4. I think that's absolutely critical for us to start thinking that way. And just for fun, the use cases and requirements draft, full title is talking about media transport. So it's actually not talking about the stuff on the left, on the right at all. So you were thinking exactly the way I was thinking. Thank you.
Hi, Luke Curley. This is fantastic.
Good.
Melzanati, yeah, I strong support doing something like this. One minor note is to avoid collisions in the namespace for tracks and these catalogs, this Bootstrap catalog. The recent thread about naming the tracks in the first place, if we go to that prefix suffix route, the null suffix could just be, synonymous with the catalog. So just the absence of a suffix would tell you that's a catalog. So there's no collision with other tracks. So,
Yeah, I had this discussion with Victor previously as well, as you can just request / right? I think requesting an explicit object is still clearer. It's deterministic. Requesting the null is like, we did that with web pages, right? And you assume it's index.html that you're going to serve, and then we ran into a whole lot of other problems. So I think keeping it explicit is maybe more robust over time.
and just to clarify my understanding, the catalog formats we will register and list, but they would only be relevant for the endpoints and not for the relays.
Yes, if you're a relay builder, you only read the mock transport on the left. You don't have to read anything on the right. If you're a endpoint implementer, you have to go read all the RFCs that define the streaming formats, and you have to go read the RFC that defines the transport.
Okay, and since we have multiple, it leaves the door open to also allow pointing to existing formats like dash manifests or HLS playlists, things like that.
We shouldn't reinvent
Okay,
CMAF containers or dash playlists or anything else. Though.
sounds like a good solution.
Bernard?
Yeah, thanks, Will, for this. I just wanted to point out one issue that I saw with the web codecs decoder config data. So the way web codecs works is that the encoder can spew that out at any time due to a change. Like, for example, say you started with a hardware encoder, it failed for some reason, you had to fail over to software and change your width and height. And when that happens, it's important to be able to correctly place the new config within the stream. And so, when you try working that out, the catalog may not always be the best place for that new info, because it has to be slapped in at a particular point in the track. So there might be you might want to define a way to transport that in band. So in the demo that I did early on, it does do that. So when it changes and spews it out again, it's slammed in at the right point, and that would be something you'd want to transmit reliably, like not set a very low timer or something on the quick reliable stream, so you're sure it gets in there.
That's a good point, Bernard. I did hint that in one of the other formats we could use tracks to distribute the init segments. In that case, you would just dispatch the new init on your track. Then there's a second problem of synchronization. You need to ensure you get the init, or that you're aware of the init before you attempt to decode the new content. But that we can specify.
Right.
Okay, Victor, we let you in since Luke was so quick.
Sure. One question I have is how does this look for publication? So I can easily see how it works for like delivery, since it's equivalent to HLS, but
When publication as in RFCs, I would expect.
No, publication as in publishing media, ingestion.
Oh, I think it works the same way. Your streaming format defines both publish, and it defines both sides of the transaction. So if you're publishing, you're going to have to publish a streaming format.
Okay.
You could publish multiple if you wanted to, but you would have to identify the one that you're preparing the content for.
I'm going to say that I really like what's in this draft, and I'm volunteering to write a PR against the current work draft to abstract this and defer to the catalog.
Great, thank you.
Two quick chair things as we move on. I think we're done.
Okay, thank you.
One is that we don't necessarily have to move anything that we think is a good idea into a single draft. We can have multiple drafts and have them refer to each other, and sometimes we make better progress that way. We can continue to discuss that. The other thing is I just want to point out here, there was an assumption here that to satisfy our charter, we need to define the mock transport in at least one streaming format. I want to point out that to satisfy our charter, we have to actually satisfy the use cases which are identified in it. So if streaming format A satisfies all those use cases, this in fact would be done. If it didn't, we might have to do more than this, just to be clear. Okay, the next person up, if you could, yeah. Yeah.
Too many slides, architectural issue discussion, and there's 2 copies. Okay, first, can we all just take a minute and like pat ourselves on the back for as much consensus as we just got? This like gotta be the most since we formed as a working group, so I'm really happy. Great work, everyone. Okay, there's a few issues that we pulled, and so Victor maybe not know that you wanted to discuss this one, so do you want to come up and just talk about it real quick?
Sure do.
All right, the mic is fine.
Okay. This is less of immediately architectural issues. This is an implementation detail, but this is something we kind of need to unblock experimentation. To provide some context, when we originally were experimenting with Quick, one of the reasons we were successful is that we had an effective way to switch between different, sometimes incompatible versions of Quick. And we had multiple mechanisms, but one of them was L service. And here we don't have, so we basically need to provide some mechanisms that lets us to upgrade between different versions. And if we kind of agree on what that mechanism is, we can start shipping some code now and then transparently upgrade it later without too much of a headache in having to like reroute between different versions. The draft currently proposes a very simple handshake format. It is, as far as I can tell, semantically equivalent to what TLS-13 does, where basically you offer a list of versions and the server picks one. And you also have a bunch of key value pairs where you can put whatever extensions you want. So I wanted to ask, are people okay with this in the sense that we will stick with it unless we have a particularly really compelling reason to change this?
Will.
Yeah, I like this idea. Given what we just said, I think we should add an extra field for the streaming format. So I might say I'm streaming format number 1, and then I'm version number 63.
The format would be, didn't we agree the format is in the catalog object or like?
It's in the catalog, but the relay is not seeing that. So the relay needs, this is the version of the protocol. Okay.
Of the transport protocol.
Retract.
No, not the payload, yeah.
So has a clarification question. So do we need to tie it to some kind of authentication mechanism so that you can no one in the middle can spoof the versions or play with it? Like TLS does it at the handshake layer, but are we expecting something here too?
This is basically the handshake that happens after you like processed your either HTTP request or TLS connection. So, but before anything that we add on top of like TLS. So this happens after we do TLS authentication. So we know you are talking to correct domain, but this happens before any application level authentication that you provide in media or Quick. And that's natural because we might change how we authenticate across versions. So.
Mozanati, does this mean that we have another round trip at the beginning of the protocol? So media startup would be delayed by another round trip?
It's complicated. So in general, the answer, if you're using web transport, not really, because web transport lets you send the HTTP connect request and the first stream simultaneously.
But so the protocol would allow you for the client to speculatively start sending things, subscribes, even though it hasn't negotiated a version? You don't just speculatively say, I think you're good with my version?
You have to wait until you get some version.
Okay, so we may have another round trip before we can actually send our subscribes.
Yeah, so that is the current consequence. We might want to think how we get around that at some point, but I don't have a good answer. That like, it is always hard to do version negotiation. You either have to do like the optimistic thing where you assume that you have the correct version and then you tear everything down, or you have to do the like this, which is like what TLS does, and it's kind of pessimistic. But the problem with optimistic is we were able to do it with Quick because we always had out-of-band information on what to expect. But if you don't have any out-of-band information, that doesn't really work.
Okay. Yeah, media startup delay is not the most critical latency, but I mean, it is, for some people, they do want to try to optimize it. So if we can eliminate some of these round trips for media startup, it would be good.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, always true, but Spencer.
Okay, I did lock the queue too after Spencer. Sorry, Jonathan.
Spencer Dawkins. This is excellent. I just note that it will be good for the working group to agree on what gets exposed to relays real soon. And for the work, like I said, I just asked the working group to focus on that because that's going to be pretty important. Thank you.
Okay, did you get the signal that you needed?
Yeah, I feel like in general we could probably, if we are going to ship something, it probably will use this handshake. Yeah, and we'll assume that if we ever change that, we'll have to deal with it later. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so here we go. This is we saved the most time for this one because it seems to have generated lots of issue was filed last night and lots of issue discussion this morning. So track is an independent component of the data model. And so the question is, should MOQ focus on delivering tracks and then any conceptual grouping of tracks are built on top of it? Or is the grouping of tracks baked in? I hope I framed that correctly. I'm not going to necessarily speak to this here, so maybe people who want to make a point, pro or con, jump in the queue and we can hear what you have to say. Go ahead, Mo.
Mosinati, just to summarize the list discussion that I was proposing to allow what both Warp and the scenarios draft want to do, which is Warp wants to be able to have a higher level concept in the track, and that can be done with a track prefix. And scenarios, especially the real-time ones, is talking about having the tracks fully qualified, and you can do that as long as the track has a prefix and a suffix. And so some elements of the protocol can always send the fully qualified prefix and suffix when they need to, and other parts of the protocol can only send the suffix if there's a prefix already implicit somewhere else, like a session ID from Web Transport. So I think there's not a need to have either side compromise. I think we can do it with prefixes and suffixes, and both people can get either fully qualified or abbreviated names.
Okay, thanks, Christian.
Type it.
Good evening, or well, good morning for you. When I think of track as independent components, I'm not speaking of the naming only. The naming is a consequence of the independence, but not the only reason. The main reason is that the body of the track is going to change at different points in the network. Do I have an echo?
We don't hear an echo here.
Okay. So basically, what I think is that I can see someone who is acting as a publisher and a receiver, for example, use tracks of the same catalogs, but in different contexts. I can see people mixing and matching tracks based on what they need currently. So I think that we really need to have this context that people can choose which track they listen to pretty much independently of whatever bundling they're using. And that's kind of the request there.
Okay, thanks. Luke.
Luke here. So I don't care too much about how the name of the track is encoded. I think that there's a little bit of discussion about that and making it optional. What this really comes down to me is the relay needs to know the priority domain. It needs to be marked somewhere to say that during congestion, you know, these tracks are separate and these tracks should be prioritized together. And that needs to be, it just needs to go, it needs to flow with the media. I think part of the desire here is that it's optional, like the subscriber chooses, but that just doesn't really work in a fan-out CDN environment. So that's my main concern here, is if you have track as the top level of the object model, a relay just has thousands of tracks and has no idea how they relate to each other, so it can't make any meaningful decisions.
Okay, Colin.
Colin James. So I think this question is sort of confuses it quite a bit. So let me try and answer a couple different variants of this question and try and hit them sort of separately a little bit. I think the thing that we subscribe to and the thing that you subscribe to or publish should be a track. Okay, I think everybody agrees upon that. I don't think that's really debated. The idea, I think the tracks need a globally unique name that you can figure out somehow by concatenating some series of prefixes, suffixes, or whatever we call them. But, you know, there's a way that you can figure out where you know, what the name of an object is, which is inside a group, inside of a track, inside of an object. Now, the separate question of, is there something that groups tracks like this prioritization domain? So, you know, all of my tracks exist inside of a prioritization domain. I think that's a fine, I think we should do that at this point. It's not, I don't actually completely agree with the prioritization domain as a concept for how we're going to do priority, but I see no problem in having this tag that groups together the tracks for who knows what reason exactly, priority being an example, and we may come to consensus that the right way to do priority is use that, but if we're going to use it, we need that data passed to the relays. I don't see any harm in having that grouping concept above there in some logical way. So I think if the question is, should tracks be in some contain, you know, in a higher level container that's in some higher level thing, yeah, sure, no problem at all. But we do need to figure out exactly how we represent those names and what the number of hierarchies are, the number of hierarchies before you even get to the full name of a track that exists. Does that make sense, Alan, or was I like talking gibberish?
Well, I struggled to frame this slide, and so I just took the issue as it was written, text in the issue. So I think maybe the way I'm trying to understand it is when a track, so I think people agree that a track can change, like you can take tracks from two sources or many sources, mix them up, rebundle them together, split them, merging. This is a use case we want to support. When you do that, is it still the same track? Does its name change? Does its name stay the same across those? I'm not sure
in my mind, a track has, I don't see tracks as changing. Tracks have inside them a group, and inside of a group there are objects. And the only thing that exists on the wire is objects, but when we group them into namings, we have the object ID, the group ID, and then the track name. And I think really most people have been discussing, how do you find the track name and what's the overall structure of it? And, you know, is the track, we could have a track ID that's inside of a catalog or a priority domain or something like that. And do we need those things? Sure, those are fine. And I don't think the encoding of them goes in every object, so it's not a bandwidth issue. We just need to, you know, like, I have no problem with adding a priority domain if that's what people want to do, which I think is what led to this whole discussion. But when we merge tracks, I mean, clients subscribe to multiple tracks that they might have found from many places.
I didn't mean merge, I meant merge two tracks, start sending two tracks that were published from two different places but are being consumed by the same consumer. So like,
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, that's a fundamental use case for us that we have to do that. I think that when we start that got confused in a bundle conversation, and this was trying to abstract a note. Bundle is not mentioned anywhere here, right? Like we can just solve all of this track naming and what the tracks are without ever discussing the web transport concept of a bundle. We may have the prioritization domain concept of there are some things that are prioritized in the way Luke has well described multiple times, right? So I was just trying to separate those things apart a little bit. So I hope that answers it.
all right, thank you. Hongxi.
Hongxi from Huawei. I think this track as an independent component kind of makes sense. Regarding the last point, track can be grouped not only by application specific, maybe different relay service provider can want to group them in different ways, so they can do kind of optimization based on their own course topology, that kind of stuff. So I don't want to say see a kind of fixed approach of the bundling across the whole chain in the standard, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Ted Hardy to the mic.
Ted Hardy, I think that one of the things that we're kind of looking at here is the question of who needs to have access to what information about the bit stream, right? So the way Will was putting it earlier, there's a bit stream and then there's a set of headers that apply to the bit stream. And our presumption is that the bit stream itself is likely encrypted in many cases, right? And so one way to look at a track is to say a track itself is a bit stream which has been independently encrypted from other content. And what goes above the track in the headers about the track may be either logically or physically present is a set of metadata about it. And among those pieces of metadata might be the priority domain or other bundling information related to it. So I think that my answer to this is we definitely need to have the track as an independent component of the data model, because the track is independently consumed both by the relays and by the end systems. So we have to have a data model view of it that carries through to what the relays need to know about that particular bit stream and what the end systems need to know once it's been decrypted. And I think the question that this is actually kind of answering by its side note is, what needs to be in that metadata about that bit stream to do the useful things that a relay has to do? And I tend to agree with Luke that part of that is you have to have enough information in that to know what the priority domain is. And so if there's a group of tracks, a group of bit streams which share a priority domain because of their relationship created by the publisher, not by the relay, then that should be something that the relay gets as information and that the end system has when it consumes it. So I think this is actually kind of conceptually an easy yes. Yes, we absolutely need the independent component, but the real question then is what structures and does the metadata sitting in the headers look like? How fixed is that, and how variable is it? Because I think what Will's presentation was proposing is it can be pretty variable because you can have different streaming formats with substantially different approaches. And Chuan Ma's presentation yesterday is proposing a particular deadline-based one that might not be in many other streaming formats, but could be an independent streaming format that sits in the same metadata carrying headers that the others have. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious here, not to try and nail this down too early, but to focus on the questions of the information that's consumed at the relay, what's available and what's not, the information that's needed by the end system, what's available to it and what's not, and in particular, how that interacts with who does things like setting the encryption context and setting the metadata context. Because there may be contexts where it actually gets changed by middle boxes and other contexts where it absolutely cannot. So we have to be a little bit cautious about deciding this too early, but I think the base answer to your question is yes.
Okay, thank you. I think we had budgeted about 15 to 20 minutes for this queue, and the queue is quite long, so I'm going to leave it open for like a minute. So if you think you're going to want to say something, get in the queue now. Suhas.
Suhas, since I created this issue, so I'm biased saying that track should be independent components, and the main reason is the confusion happens is because when we build a system, we are building a mock transport as a set of tools on which we can envision different application requirements. And if you look at what should the base model should have, the track is where we should stop. Anything above that, how do you want to group because of the prioritization domain or because of some other reason that application has envisioned, that should be built on top of that. And on the prioritization itself, what the object should carry so that relays can make the decision. We have multiple proposals out there, like Luke has one proposal, Christian has another proposal.
Next slide's on priority, just so you know.
So we need to basically, we need to basically spend time on that and figure it out. For this one, I would say, track should be independently subscribable. And to make that happen, we should have the track ID to be fully qualified.
Okay, thank you. Will?
Yeah, Will, I'm also agreeing the track should be independent. I think the mechanism where we create the prefix and it's tied to web transport is a compression efficiency. And we've already agreed we have a subscribe request and a subscribe reply. So we have a handshake built in that can implement any sort of aliasing scheme that we want. And that works whether I'm over raw quick or I'm over web transport. So it's really clean if our track identification is independent of the transport it's being moved over. And within the ID, I think we need to communicate two things. One is something I call an orchestration domain. Who's organizing this track? And this is the entity responsible for authentication, encryption, and access control. And the second one is the prioritization domain. Now, different entities may agree to share prioritization domains, or they may be a subset of an entity that's to be defined. But we need to communicate those two things. They can be part of the same URL, the same name, because we have a strict naming scheme, or we just have them as two fields. But they would be inside every object. And Luke, you said, well, what does a relay do when it has tens of thousands of tracks? It looks for each of them, it organizes them by orchestration domain, priority domain, and then it applies its rules for prioritization consistently across the matching domains.
Okay, thanks. Christian. You might need to unmute.
Okay, so my mouse was double clicking on the mute button, which makes it mute to mute. Sorry about that. One thing I would like to insist is that we distinguish between a name and a property. There is always a trend to build your identifier by embedding in the name the properties that you want. And there's a long history of people trying to do that and then realizing a couple of years later that it was a mistake. So we want to have one thing which is a name and be very careful about what we want the name to be and to indicate and to be routed in, and what is a property. And the properties, we can always tag them after somehow. In the name, I think that what Will was mentioning is basically the authorization domain or the orchestration domain. I mean, the relay has to be able to look at the name and say, who's going to tell me whether that particular user at this IP address is authorized to look at this content? And I think this tying to the authorization is the key property of the name. I mean, if you don't make that part of the name, you don't have an authorization model. Everything else, be it a property like what kind of media types, what kind of prioritization scheme, etc., that can be set as a property. That's not part of the top-level naming requirement. But we have to do that work of looking at how we do that. And we should not imagine that we have just a long thing of hierarchy, because that's not going to work.
Okay, thanks. Mo.
Mosinati. I think the last point is a good point. Allow tracks to be grouped for identification or other purposes. And the second bullet is talking about authorization purposes. So I think it's important for us to understand whether or not the groupings that we come up with are common groupings for most purposes, including authorization, priority domains, and all that, or do we need multiple groupings? Because I think that would greatly complicate things if there are different levels of groupings of tracks for different purposes. So I think we should try to figure that out. And if we can come to a common grouping for most purposes, that would be a win.
Okay, thanks. Victor.
I think, at least for me, the question comes down to when are tracks allowed to share the same transport, and when the tracks are required to share the same transport, and when they're required to not share the same transport. So fundamentally, at least, like, I imagine you can always request a different individual track on each own transport, just like by establishing the connection, subscribing to that track, opening another connection, subscribing to the other track, even if you had subscribed it on the same connection. So from that perspective, like, this is the one, like, limit case. But the other limit case, which I kind of want to avoid, is I want, like, in HTTP, we have this notion of authority, is that, like, if I'm talking to google.com, I'm going to receive web pages for google.com, and I'm not going to receive them for example.org, because google.com is not authoritative for example.org. And at least here, I see this, we need to make sure that, like, the tracks can be only grouped and accessed together when they share some notion of authority, and at least, like, in current versions, this is effectively what a web transport URL does. But
When you say authority there, Victor, do you mean authority in the sense that an HTTP authority would be?
yes, that is exactly the same. Yeah.
I guess my question, what does google.com do right now if it gets a request for example.org?
404.
So would something similar work in this model or not?
Work, but I have a question of why do you want to allow that to happen?
I don't. I mean, I don't know.
So the question is, like, do we want to allow that to happen, and do we need to allow that to happen? Because if you only allow relative track names, you only will get receive the names for which you're already authoritative.
I think this might need some more discussion, because I think the question of authority from the HTTP perspective might be distinct from the other groupings we're talking about. In particular, it might be distinct from the question of authorization domain and who applied the encryption. And I can point you offline to how the sports example I talked through earlier would be a problem for that, but we probably don't want to take the full amount of time that that would take. So
Thank you.
let's chat offline.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Luke.
Yeah, Luke here again. So I strongly agree with Ted in that this is the prioritization domain is a property of the track. It's a member. You can think of it like a field on it. And then it really comes down to who needs to know that prioritization domain. The relay needs to know it when it's sending. So if there's congestion, it can obey it. But I would even say the receiver needs to know it because it needs to know which transport to use, in Victor's point. Like if I want to subscribe to two URLs, like two fully qualified track URLs, should I use the same connection or should I use different connections? And if they're in the same priority domain, I should use the same connection. And if they're separate ones, I should use different connections. So that's why I see it as a tuple. It's almost like the priority domain, comma, the track URL is what you need to subscribe to. Or at least you need to know as a receiver. And it could be part of the same URL. We could have a scheme to say it's the first X bytes or it's up until the first slash. But I think having them two separate fields is just more future compatible than encoding into a URL.
So I have a follow-up question about what you said about the receiver needing to know. I guess my understanding is that the catalog is telling you like what what you can subscribe to on this transport.
Effectively, the catalog tells you use this web transport URL to connect to it, and that is effectively the prioritization domain or the bundle in the current scheme. It's just telling you what connection to use. It's telling you how to pool.
Okay. Harold.
Harald Olvestrand. Now, MOQ is not WebRTC, but when we designed WebRTC in the first place, we conceived of it as streams consisting of tracks, which very much resembles the bundles or whatever, and it was a mistake. We switched to a model where the primary object is, for transmission purpose, is the track, and the stream is almost, in an API sense, an afterthought. So if history is any guidance, you should keep focus on shuffling around the tracks and then sending data about tracks as appropriate. There's a basic principle of this database design that says if you have a primary key for a table, don't embed information in it. You're going to regret it. In the case of identifying, the fact that a track at the moment appears in a specific group of some kind is not a property that you want to keep around forever. Therefore, it should not be part of the name. So keep on track, folks.
Okay, Colin is going to get the last word on this.
Okay, I think we got some variety of really wise architectural advice from various people over there, and I'm going to try and summarize a bit of a proposal going forward here. I think the idea that there's, I think we all agree on tracks are the thing that we subscribe and deal with at some level, okay? But the properties of them, I think we should very much, we've got several people saying, just carry that as a property separately. That doesn't mean it's in every object, it doesn't take any extra bandwidth, we'll just send it at the beginning as a property, whatever properties we have. Now, there's a few different properties I've heard that I think that we need to be able to deal with here. There is the prioritization domain property, right? Which is a simple one. I think we understand that. It's pretty easy to add in. There's an authorization domain type property, which would, keep in mind that it's not just like, if this is deployed on a CDN type network, somebody's paying for usage of these relays. And you're talking about authorization is about billing and about who's going to pay for this. So, we need to be able to authorize at least at the granularity of, separating the WebEx traffic from the Twitch traffic, right? So you're going to take hopefully what I would assume is that a track was, you could tell, that when the authorization was set up with it, you'd be able to get some token for a track and check that it, and which authorization domain or group it was in, and check that that token worked for that and that was inside the track space it was supposed to be. And even inside something like WebEx, you don't want to issue tokens for one conference that allow people to totally DDoS a different conference, right? So they're finer granularity than just the vendor that might be built. So that's a separate property. And again, that's never going to map up exactly with the prioritization domain. Like it's a separate property. I think this goes right back to what several people said. And then we have the one Harold was talking about that we had in WebRTC. We might have like a lip sync grouping, like these tracks are grouped in some way of a property that tells you your lip syncs. Maybe there's explicit property for that. Maybe you get it from a catalog, whatever. But that was what drove the stream concept originally in WebRTC, and I totally agree with Harold that we don't want to replicate that. But that's a separate property. So I think we're already seeing a range of properties. So I think what we ought to do here is figure out how we get a fully unique, a way to get the fully qualified name for a track, not embed properties in that name, and then provide another way, an alternative way to add whatever properties we think we need to that track, with the priority domain being like the first one that we add right there, and figure that out for the prioritization. So, I mean, people sort of generally agree with that, thumbs up or total thumbs down. Victor's so-so, Mo's maybe a little bit. Okay. So, something along those lines is what I was thinking.
Could you share the list you just created with the note taker and make sure that it's captured? Because it was a lot for him to try and digest.
I'll help, but Magnus knew what I was going to say before I stood up, so it should be easy for him to replicate it.
You might be able to get one of the chocolate bars if you do a good job capturing your own notes. Okay. All right. We have talked a lot about this. Let's talk about something else. We are running a little bit over time, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to get into these in deep detail. So there's an issue about prioritization schemes need some flexibility. I've tried to summarize here. So the WIP4 draft, in terms of prioritization, expresses it only in send order, and then it will also inherit, I used the word bundle when I wrote this slide, but maybe I'm regretting it, I don't know. It inherits the prioritization of groups of things by what's going on in web transport, right? Which we talked about in web transport earlier this week, in multiple web transport sessions. You can prioritize those sessions, and then if you have streams or datagrams hanging off of those things, then that is like a sort of nested layer. So that is what is currently in WARP4. MOQ-T has a different scheme, and Christian talked about it yesterday in terms of what is possible with different mappings. Mo made a comment on the list about a week or two ago and said, maybe we should deprioritize the priority discussion. And Ted and I feel like we don't have a lot of consensus right now in terms of what the priority for what the prioritization scheme is going to be. And the working group is likely going to continue experimenting with lots of different prioritization schemes for some time. Ted wants to add.
Yeah, just that there's been actually a lot of good discussion today since this slide was written. So I think we've actually made a good bit of progress on how people understand the different types of priority and how they would apply to the bit streams. And so it may very well be that this is not as contentious as it looked in the morning, which is great. When you have a day that goes well, that's good. So we really encourage people who've been commenting on this to follow up on the list, make sure that your viewpoints are captured in the minutes and that we can go forward from this afternoon's place in the discussion rather than this morning's place in the discussion. But we also don't think it's going to be really useful at this point to continue more discussion on this right now. So we're going to keep moving.
And then the last issue, which was raised for discussion today, which again, we don't really have a ton of time for, is to talk about how much the draft needs to speak about relay behavior. And for example, there's some of the things here that could be specified. There was also some discussion on that issue on the list, but I think I'm going to refer everybody to the issue and to the list and for now, and we'll move on. Sound good? All right.
The next thing is the
framing. It's you.
Yeah, the framing. Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about is how we will frame an adoption call. Remember, we are not doing an adoption call today. This is just discussion of how this works. I have no idea what we have. Two of everything, and we don't really know why we have two of everything. The great thing about putting your slides up early is you get comments on them, and I got a very cogent criticism that these are in fact terrible. So I don't plan to spend a lot of time on them. The high order bit here is that when you do an adoption call, you have this question: what does a draft really need? How far along do you have to be? And then there was some confusion in the community that had to be basically done. For those of you who don't follow the work of Cézanne, this is one of his masterpieces, 5 Bagneuses, clearly done in hanging in a museum, worth millions of dollars. We don't need the draft to be here. We definitely understand that a draft comes in. It is not a done work with just polishing. It's something a good bit less than that. And so here's an example of a good bit less than that. This is the sketch that eventually led to 5 Bagneuses. As you can see, there's no paint here. There's a lot of detail missing, but it's still kind of fundamentally present. The other thing to recognize, and I think this is kind of where this might have gone off the rails, is that you can start out with this and end up here. And was having lunch yesterday with one of the folks who worked on Quick, who reminded me that every single bit in the bit format of Quick changed during the course of the working group. There was not a single bit that started out in Google Quick that ended up being the same in the IETF Quick. So understand there can be change. That doesn't mean you want to adopt something that can either turn into cinq bagneuses or this one, but you are asking yourself this question: is it possible to get from this draft to done? And so when the next version comes out of the drafts that we either are considering for adoption, we will be starting, is it possible to get from this draft to done? And let's be honest, you could start from a blank sheet of paper or an unrelated draft. And if you haven't read Warren Kumari's magnum opus, This Is Not a Draft, you should definitely do so. But we want to start from something that's heading us in the right direction, even if we think there are going to be some potential twists and turns. And that's the question the chairs will be asking when we get to the draft discussion, adoption discussion at some point later. So we just wanted to be clear, since there are a lot of people who are new to the IETF, that when we issue a call for adoption, we're not asking, is this done? We're asking if it's a reasonable basis for working group effort. Are there clarifying questions on this point? Is there anybody who hates Cezanne and really figures I should have picked somebody? Oh, probably not Cullen. Do you?
No, an
Who
amazing
hates
artist.
Cezanne?
Of course, Austin. I would offer a constructive comment, a positive constructive comment, which is, I think that the right question that many working groups ask is, when is the optimal time to adopt something? And I think that my feel of that is that it's definitely not the blank sheet of paper. We've seen that tried. It seldom works out well in Kumari's experiment. But is when you have enough of it there that it's much harder to make changes to a document that's a working group document than make changes to a document that's not a working group document. That's just a sort of fact of life of what consensus you need to change on the document. And so often I think that the optimal time is when the document has enough belief that the working group can look at it and view it as a sketch of enough information in it to see a sketch of how it's going to evolve from where it is today to where it to the end goal of meeting the goals of the charter, right? And that doesn't mean it's clearly not done at that point, far from done, but just at the point that people can see that the basic form of how it's going to get from your sketch, from the basic sketch in your analogy. From there, you can sort of imagine, well, there's a lot of color that needs to be added before that's a painting. But you can get the idea of where it's going to go. So I think the right thing to do is think about what's the conditions for optimal adoption, what's the change process before and after adoption. And I think we're very close to it on a ton of this stuff. So, I hope that happens soon.
Okay. Any other clarifying questions or comments? Okay, I think that brings us to the end of that topic. Spencer, you are up.
Yeah, Spencer Dawkins, and talking about the what we keep calling the requirements draft, but it's actually the use cases and requirements draft. Next slide, please. So there's a chair poll on adoption for version 4 of this draft. It's active now, between now and 14th of April. Please send feedback. The scenarios draft was submitted, like 2 weeks ago, something like that. And it contains section 2 on scenarios and section 3 on differences between scenarios. And that overlaps with section 3 in the use cases and requirements draft. Also, it contains section 4 on handling scalable video codecs that overlaps with section 4 on requirements in the requirements draft. Authors from both drafts talked this week, and We've committed to work together to integrate text, recognizing that this is not just cut and paste, that it requires thought. The next slide, please. So once we get that done, which seems like a great next step, scanning the core draft repo and the draft itself for generic requirements. A lot of things have been discussed there, whether they made it into the draft or not. And so my understanding of what we're doing is that WARP-specific requirements would stay in WARP, but the requirements that would be applicable to any media over a quick draft would move. And beyond that, continuing to focus on additional generic requirements. I want to do updates that reflect the architecture that is in use in working group discussions after a minimal architecture becomes accepted. I would point in the general direction of the Arch draft that was submitted about the same time as the scenarios draft, and update to reflect terminology that's in use in the working group after the working group converges on accepted terminology. So my thing here is basically to tell you if you are expressing opinions about adoption of the requirements draft. I think James and I owe it to the working group for you to know what happens next. I'll stop for questions. That's my last slide.
Jonathan Lennox.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hello. So you see this also becoming an architecture draft, or do we need an architecture draft? Because, you said update reflect architecture, but somewhere we need to define the architecture. Things like terminology, just often in
Jonathan, I think we had a little trouble hearing you. Can you go back and maybe speak a little slower?
Sure, yeah, sorry. I was once saying, do you see this also becoming an architecture draft and terminology draft? Or do you see that as living somewhere else and you would just simply adopt it here?
So the working group is chartered to have an architecture draft, and it seemed like that was, I actually looked at that before I looked at scenarios, and that the architecture draft that was submitted a couple of weeks ago seemed like a really plausible start towards meeting that deliverable as well.
Okay. And you would simply reflect what that does. This would be a.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Any others?
On the terminology question, the chairs believe a fast-moving wiki is the only hope.
That may very well be true. So my only hope is to use enough consistency to make global changes trivial. In my draft, in James and my draft.
You just need to subscribe to it. We'll publish changes to the terminology.
Suhas, being one of the authors on the scenarios draft, I think this is a good plan. We need to figure out how some of the requirements raised by Ali as well in the general scenarios. We need to see how we get those into, because the scenarios or what the use cases draft drive the requirement, and we should have used that to kind of work on the protocol, and that's the reason why there's a gap, like yesterday as you presented, and working on this will be helpful.
Thank you, Suhas. And I'm just expressing another opinion here that basically, I think it is fair to say that discussion is going to be required on an ongoing basis for a lot of things, but we just wanted to start getting something stable that the working group could point to, and we're not worried about making circuitous progress, making progress in circles. Hi, Ali.
So I volunteered to do the terminology draft, and I am still willing to do that. So wiki or draft, but at least to get everybody on the same page.
How do you feel about a wiki?
That's fine.
I think we might want to start there and then.
Or we might just start with a Google document.
Okay. There is a wiki facility already built into into IETF working groups. If you're not familiar with this, we can walk you through how to work.
Well, I did one recent with MOPS. Is that the new one? The new wiki? Yeah.
I think we might really want to start there. We were only very slightly joking about that.
Yeah, and we were only very slightly laughing.
No, I thought you were quite serious.
Okay, well, the queue is over and I've just been insulted. So Spencer, step down. So.
Can I spend a minute talking about interims?
Originally at this point, we were supposed to talk about whether or not we needed an interim and logistics about the same. Given the short amount of time we have, we probably don't, we'll probably just take this to the list. But the chairs continue to think that having interim meetings, especially between now and late July, is going to be important for us to continue to make progress. So we'll probably think about doing that virtual. Ali, are you going to suggest meeting at Mile High in Denver?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Just to let people know that there's this video conference in Denver, Colorado, May 7th through 10th. A lot of people in this room are going to be there already. So, and Comcast is willing to host a meeting right after Mile High video if there's interest.
So we appreciate that, and thank you especially for the offer of hosting. We did hear from some people who are planning on being there that they've already bought their tickets, though. So we may have a little bit of a conflict there where it might be, in fact, a little bit difficult for people, despite the fact they're going to be at Mile High. So let's go to the next one, which is Jordy.
And as Jordy comes up here, I will say goodbye as I have to run and catch my plane, but it's been lovely, all of you. Thank you for coming. Have a safe trip home.
I was planning to do a real-time demo, so can I share my screen at least?
Yeah, sure. Let me stop sharing, and you'll request
this
a permission, and I'll have to grant it to you. So. I will point out that our area director already left, and now that the co-chair is gone, I'm totally leash free, and who knows what might happen in the last few minutes of the meeting. You should definitely stay here for whatever excitement comes.
Whatever.
If we're done, we're done. Okay, so I got.
Okay.
Why don't you sit down? Yeah, there you go. Deputy co-chair.
I don't see your request yet.
So here. Should I react?
No, wait. Okay. No, I think I just was looking in the wrong place for it.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Window and screen. Good. Okay. Hello, Jordi Sansano from Meta. And I'm going to present a proof of concept that we built in open source about Media Work Week. So, okay. So this first, let me start with a disclaimer. This is not the way of doing Media Work Week. We're still figuring that out. It's just a way because I was really motivated for all the amazing ideas that I'm hearing in these meetings. So I just wanted to try them. And also my main goal was to learn, because usually I'm lost in a very deep discussions that most of you are having. So I thought that implementing those ideas will help me to follow those discussions, and definitely they did. And the future, I hope that this could be the seed or the experimentation, or at least an experimentation test bed of the ideas that we are hearing in these meetings. Okay, so use cases that this proof of concept implements: ingest, ultra low latency live; egress, ultra low latency live. This is basically the main use case that we are talking in these meetings, but it also implements live rewind and VOD. That I think this could be very interesting in the future. Now we are focusing the live edge case, but I think that those use cases could be quite interesting. What it is not, it does not have yet priorities, and it does not have yet ABR. So basically, this is what it is. And definitely, I saw that the technologies are converging in a place that this was possible. So basically, web transport is available in the browser since a few time ago. Web codecs are also now available in the browser, in Chrome specifically, and now in Firefox too. So basically, I combined those technologies and I built an encoder that uses web codecs for low latency encoding, opens a web transport connection to a relay that I also built a relay on top of QuickGo. And inside that web transport connection, it creates a unidirectional stream per frame, per video and audio frame. And then the decoder on the player. It's also a web application that leverages web transport and web codecs. And it opens a web transport connection to that relay. And that relay, and this is a push model base, that relay creates unidirectional streams from the relay to the player, sending, again, stream per frame. So in this case, a frame, a video and audio frame is what we call an object. So this is, as I said, it's a web application. The relay is a Golang application on top of QuickGo. I already explained that. And the decoder is the player is another web application. And very important, the relay, if we want to have the ultra low latency capability, needs to implement read while write. So basically, my implementation it just reads the first few bytes of every object now and then. It can identify the object, and that is put into a memory cache. And since that moment, all the rest of the bytes can be just pushed through the relay to all the subscribers, so to all the decoder or players. Okay, this is the demo. So it's very risky to do a demo with this Wi-Fi, but I'm going to try. My relay is, I have two relays for experimentation, one in Oregon, another one in Frankfurt in Europe. I'm going to use the one in Oregon. I Googled it yesterday, and the distance is 8,000 kilometers, and the round trip time is not very consistent, but it's around 140 milliseconds from my hotel to the relay. So now let me try to do the demo. Okay, so this is the player, and this is the encoder. So let me start by refreshing the page. And now here I have a lot of parameters. This is the ones that I need to stream. It's by default, they put some interesting ones. So I'm going to keep it. And it also gives me a stream ID. Okay, I'm going to start the streaming, opening a web transport and sending objects. Here, there is a lot of interesting data. Now, I'm sending those objects to my relay. And here, I'm just exposing a lot of metrics, because this is experimentation, so I thought metrics was important. In-flight requests, so there's a lot of in-flight requests. This is the maximum that I'm using, and this is the real time, the ones that I'm using right now. So around 20, it's the average. And then every time that I drop a chunk, an object, I call it here a chunk, but there is a log line or a line here explaining why. Okay, now we are streaming. So let's go to the player. And by default is the live edge mode. Let's keep this one. And subscribing to that stream. I'm subscribing and I'm starting receiving data. Okay, hello. So latency is around, it's measured because I'm putting timing information in every packet. So it's around 400 milliseconds. I think it's not bad, considering that this Wi-Fi and also the distance that we are streaming. One thing that it took me a lot of time is this client prioritizes audio, or this system prioritizes audio over video, and also keeps audio and video in sync in this partial reliable environment. This was what took most of the time of this proof of concept. And this is live edge, but what we can do is exactly the same setup. I'm just having the same stream. I can also select, let me reload, just in case. I can also select another mode. And again, I have the other player. So now I'm subscribing another player, and I'm saying rewind 10 seconds ago. And now I'm just setting another defaults, bigger jitter buffers, because now the latency, I don't care anymore. I want what is happening live from 10 seconds ago. I click start. And okay, look that the latency now is 10 seconds and something. Because since that latency is calculated from one frame is captured to one frame is displayed, so it's an end-to-end. So now that latency shows obviously more than 10 seconds. And then here I have real-time metrics about the maxer, the jitter buffers, the decoders, the timestamps that I'm using, the buffers, the amount that I have buffered, and blah, 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 blah. And I can also do another thing with the same setup. Now, let's subscribe. Let's create a VOD. Same stream, and I want now, let's put this 1 minute ago, 3700. And now let's put 38. And again, against defaults, when I select highlights, it puts some default values for the jitter buffers because this is not latency sensitive anymore. And 29. Okay, probably I was not streaming at that time. Okay, let me just try it again, and if not, so this is just a POC. Okay. Oh, okay, I know what happened. That was not the time. I need to refresh to put the time. Okay, perfect. So now, yes, now this is 49. Sorry. Now, yes, 49. And now 50. Now, yes, now it will work. It was a silly mistake. I hope it will work. Okay, anyway, I can open the debugging. But anyway, this is the POC. So let's go back to the slides. So some data from a very short experimentation that I was able to do. Here in this demo that you just saw, I was streaming 500 kilobits per second video and H.264 and, sorry, Opus audio, this is wrong. Opus audio 32 kilobits. The jitter buffer that I set for the ultra low latency demo was 200 milliseconds, and we got an end-to-end latency of 400 milliseconds. I think, again, for a first implementation, non-optimized, I think personally it's a good starting point. And the quality of experience, at least yesterday from my hotel with these settings, it was a very good. It was more than better quality than video conferencing.
You have a question whether the end-to-end is glass to glass.
It's glass to glass, yes. And okay, I'm not going to enter into the details, but since this was for experimentation, what I tried to create is a very simplistic and separation of concerns implementation. So basically, this is not optimized for production at all, but I think it's optimized for experimentation. So I can in the last 2 days, I added a new container, a new packager, just modifying a couple of classes. So this is the class structure or the implementation structure of the encoder. Again, it's leveraging web codecs and obviously workers in the player and web transport. And this is the same for the player. So leveraging web codecs, shared buffer array for audio. The audio is a little bit trickier in the player. But again, same technology, same base technologies, web transport, web codecs, and web workers. And relay, media package or container. So I started with a very simple container, JSON in this, and then Will pointed that was not very efficient at all. And then I changed to a binary packager, much more efficient. 92% of bytes that we send to the transport are payload bytes, and 8% are header bytes. And this is taken into account that the audio is 32 kilobits per second, so that the bitrate is quite low. So this, I explained here the conditions and basically all the data that I thought it was needed for the relay to understand. So this is the data in the header is the one that the relay reads. The rest of the data, the payload, is just the relay does not read them, does not understand it. It just forwards them. And what else? And this is, I think, my last slide. So the relay, it's a very simplistic implementation. Again, it's experimental. It has 2 entry points, ingest and delivery, and it has a memory cache. The cache key is the stream ID. In this case, that would be, I think, in the last consensus would be a bundle. And that is in the web transport. It's from the web transport session. And then a media type and sequence ID, those are from the object header. And this is the unique cache key per every object. So if you have that, it's and you have the URL that is unique globally. And I put a couple of examples. And also important to say before the last slide, the player sends to the egress controller few parameters that allow the egress controller that it has a small class that controls the delivery session, since it's a push based, that needs information from the player, such as the jitter buffer sizes, the packager that the player understands, and in case of the BOD, the start and ending times, and in case of the rewind, also the rewind time. So this goes as this player sends that information to the relay based inside the query string parameters of the web transport session. And finally, all of this is open source. All of this code is in these two repos. So please experiment, open PRs. I will try to be as responsive and responsible too as possible. Thanks a lot.
Suhas, Jordi, thanks for doing this and also making it open source. That it gives us a way for us to try out different use cases. And I had no other comments to say other than saying thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much.
And also, if you can, from this demo or experiments, learn something that you can bring it to the working group, please feel to do that.
Yeah, we'll try.
Bernard.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank you, Jordi, for doing this. There's a few things we can probably chat with offline. There's some bugs that I think you may be hitting in transferring the video frames one by one. There's an API that transfers the whole stream, so you may get better performance and avoid some of those bugs. But we can talk, but it's a very nice performance that you're getting. I think we can make it even better.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and I'm really looking forward to hear those tips. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. We are actually 1 minute over time, which is very good timing for an IETF. Yes. Thanks everybody for being here, for joining us here in Yokohama or remotely. We will see you on the list where we will coordinate our next probably interim meeting. And once again, we do appreciate that there's been a lot of great hallway conversation while we were here together. If you didn't get to be a part of it and you have questions about what happened, please do post those questions on the list. And I'm sure that the people who are involved in them will help bring you up to speed on any of the context that you may be missing. Thanks again and see you soon.
No.